World Religions is a program that seeks to inspire and inform people of faith about the world's great religions. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Sister Nancy Dawson.
Hello and welcome to our show, World Religions. I'm Father Jim Corda. Joining me in this series is Sister Nancy Dawson. It's nice to have you on the show today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be here. I enjoy the studio, and the ministry that you do is unbelievable.
Well, we know that you're an adjunct professor at YSU, and so you've got quite a knowledge of the world's religions, and today we're going to focus on Islam. I guess the first thing we might want to talk about is why sometimes does Islam in this day and age get a bad rap?
Well, I think probably it's a misunderstanding of the faith tradition itself. And I think a lot of times people get mixed up on the word jihad, meaning, to struggle. And I don't think that they interpret it correctly according to its historical meaning and according to what it means in the Quran. I'm not an expert on Islam, trust me, but I think the whole idea was the struggle that goes on within yourself. And I think people misunderstand sometimes and always see it in terms of war, in terms of fighting, such as the experience we're having today in Syria.
And I would imagine that any of the world's religions has that aspect in it. For example, going back in Catholicism to the Crusades.
Right.
Historically, there's some aspect of the world's religions that maybe border on the dark side. But what we try to do as people of faith is to kind of elevate that bright side, the beauty and the peace and the joy of what religion is all about. It might be helpful before we get into our discussion of Islam is to talk about what actually religion is. When we talk about world religions, what are we talking about? Are we talking about faith? Are we talking about a book, people?
Well, I always, in teaching, we look at the Latin word religion, and the word itself means to reconnect or to connect. If you take a look at one of your ligaments, and it puts two parts together. And so one of the first assignments I always give them is to name in your life an experience that would be a connecting or reconnecting experience. It could be a death, it could be a birth, it could be an experience in nature, it could be a concert, it could be a wonderful piece of music that you hear. And so when we talk about it, we're talking about religion is connecting with the other. Now, in this faith tradition, they're going to call the other Allah. In Buddhist tradition, they may have another name. Each tradition will name that other experience. So I think it's a connecting with some other by whatever name you want to use. One writer says, whatever tastes sweet to your lips, that is the other.
And that's really a wonderful analogy to use that, because getting in touch with the other is ultimately getting in touch with that supreme being, or that in our faith in God. And so there's that whole sense that God becomes somehow personalized within us, and it's someone that we could talk to and relate with. And obviously in Islam, it's interesting because the Arabic use the word Allah for their God. But that whole idea of Islam, there's a sense of submission and obedience. Let's talk a little bit about that aspect of Islam and why that is so important in their religion, to be submissive.
I think maybe in one of their movements, the Sufi movement, I've heard Thomas Merton's take on that. In this particular faith tradition, they see God as being in the Sufi movement as close to us as our jugular vein. And so that we have emptied ourselves out, and there is then just the presence of Allah in one's life, and that everything goes through the heart, that the heart They talk about in spirituality the circumcised heart, the heart filled with love, emptied of everything. So it's almost like you submit your whole life to the presence of Allah, who is responsible for everything. There's nothing left within you except that heart that's filled with love and peace, which is really what Islam's all about, peace. And I've heard from one of the imams one time that maybe sometimes we shouldn't always define Islam as being submissive. They don't see it as that, but more of a peace and that emptying out and that presence to Allah in one's life, rather than that notion of being obedient to or submissive to. So I think there's different ways to explain that term.
And I would think, if I recall in some of my study of Islam, that the actual Arabic word also for Islam means peace, or
exactly.
In the Jewish tradition, shalom.
Right.
You know, that whole sense of surrendering to the highest God, the God of peace and surrender, and ultimately the God of love. Let's talk perhaps about Muhammad himself.
Oh, yes.
I know that he was born in 570 of the Christian era and died 62 years later. Let's talk about him and his life and what was going on at the time. And I think it's always important when we talk about a prophet to kind of get what we use the term the sitz and Laban. What was going on at the time? What was the situation? So what was in the known world happening?
Well, at that time, as you know, there were caravans. And I think it's interesting that he worked in the caravan, and he worked for who became his wife, Khadijah. He was 25, and she was 15 years older than he was. But I thought it was kind of interesting that you have a woman running a business already. But in his life, there were some really key events. And I think one of the first ones happened at the age of probably about 29, I'm thinking, maybe, when he was on Mount Hira. And they say that this is when he received the Quran, or the very first time that he was asked to recite the Quran 3 times. You get that idea of recitation over and over. And I think that's a very key event that's celebrated in the history of Muhammad. I think the second one, and by the way, at that time, his only followers were his family, his wife, his friend, Abu Bakr, and also Ali, his cousin. Those were the first Muslims. Well, he wasn't accepted in his own land. Now, the second event was what they call the Midnight Journey. And in that journey was like a dream where he goes to Jerusalem. And again, you have those 3 centers, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And I think the third big event in his life is when he had to leave his own country. You know, the prophet is not accepted there. And he makes the journey, which becomes later on the Hajj. He goes to Mecca. Some of the values he had were not accepted by the people. He believed in giving to the poor, that you shouldn't have more than 4 wives, maybe. So some of the values he was preaching, that you have to pledge some of your money to take care of those that do not have it. His attitude toward women was very positive. So I think there were things that he represented at that time that was very difficult for the people to accept. And that's kind of some of the key events in his life, I think.
And we know that Islam is a Abrahamic religion. So it's obviously monotheistic, but so Abraham is very important and central in that. Let's talk historically about that.
Well, I think one of the, first of all, we know that in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, that they have a lot in common. They're all monotheistic. They all believe that there's another life after this. They do. Abraham, in all of those traditions, is considered the father. And in Islam, the story goes back. I think one of the differences is going back to the story of Abraham, who had 2 sons, if you recollect. And one was Sarah could not have children, but he had the slave girl. She gave permission, Hagar, and they had a son, Ishmael. Now, in the Islamic tradition, they would go back and say that the son that Abraham was going to sacrifice was Ishmael, whereas we would say, no, it's the other son, Isaac. And then, of course, Hagar got dispelled from the family, went into the desert, and then you had that story of the big fountain coming up so that they would have enough water to survive that situation. So that's kind of the role that Abraham plays in that tradition, whereas in the Christian tradition, we look back in history as the son being Isaac.
And we know that in Jerusalem, at the Temple Mount, there is the place where, I believe, where they say that Abraham had tried to sacrifice his son, but that was also the spot where Muhammad rose to the heavens. So that's a holy spot
ground,
for them, as well as Mecca. Let's talk briefly about, there's 5 pillars in Islam. And it's interesting because I did a show with Dr. Mir on Islam, and I found it not only fascinating, but comparative in a sense too with our own Christian Catholic faith.
Yes.
For example, the pillars of almsgiving, of pilgrimage, of testimony, fasting. These are things that are part of people of faith and a part of their life as well. So let's focus on those 5 pillars.
Sure.
Let's talk about testimony first of all. What exactly does Islam say about testimony?
Well, the one word or the one phrase that summarizes their whole belief system is that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This is the summary of everything that they believe in, and that's recited many, many times. I find that interesting. One of the things that always fascinates me is the dikar, the little beads. Mm-hmm. And they, again, have 99 names for Allah. And each one of those beads is characteristic, compassion, supreme. And they're said over and over again. You get that mantra idea. And I think they give a lot of witness when you see these in an airport and somebody's saying them. And I often think, in Christianity and especially being Catholic, the park's right across the street from us, and I don't see any reason why I shouldn't go around saying the rosary. I think it's great witness, it's great testimony to people that someone is praying at every hour of the day. So that's one of the pillars, I think, that kind of summarizes their belief system.
And that actually gets us to the second pillar, which is prayer.
Right.
We know that they pray 5 times in the day. And is that relational because of things that are going on in the cosmic world, those different times?
I would suppose they are. I'm not sure myself on that. But I think it's a tribute to their faith tradition that they are always in the present. And that's a challenge for many of us in our world today in terms of our own faith. We're busy going here and going there. I think it's a way of just recalling that Allah is present in everything that they do. And probably it is a cosmic development too, because they pray early before the sun comes up. They pray at different times of the day until the sun goes down. And it keeps them constantly in tune with the universe as well as with Allah, who's responsible for it in their faith tradition.
Well, what's interesting about that is that you had mentioned their almost constant contact with the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And how important is that in the life of a person of faith, to be constantly aware of our surroundings, that God is present, and how often in our own hustle and bustle that we forget that God is there.
And maybe we have to remind each other, and I think that's what they do. They have the muezzin that goes up to the beautiful, beautiful architecture, the minaret, and they're excellent pieces of art, and then calls the folks to prayer. Now, I don't think that can happen as often today. And I do know in working in one of the prisons in Elkton that with the Muslim community, that they would have to have another way sometimes of having that call to prayer. And so maybe we have to remind each other by our own lives that, we do have to be in the presence of God.
And I know from my own personal experience, being in parts of the world where Islam is pretty predominant. For example, I remember being in Morocco and in Egypt,
Oh, yes.
and you hear literally 5 times a day the call of the Muslim who lets them know that this is a time to stop, to recall the presence of God, and how important that is, in our own Christian life. And I try to remember of the Liturgy of the Hours, for example.
Yes,
we
yes.
pray, I believe there's 8 or 9 different times within a 24-hour period where as Catholic Christians, we pause, we call to mind the presence of God, morning, noon, night, and so forth.
And
so
of
how
course,
important
remember
it
the
is.
Angelus and the bells ringing at
Exactly.
12 o'clock,
Exactly.
and part of our tradition too, indeed. I think that another way that I've learned to appreciate that idea is through some of the beautiful poetry that's come out of this tradition. We all know Rumi in the 1200s, but does everybody know about Rabia, who was the woman poetess? And she's almost considered, how we have saints in some of the other traditions? She is considered a saint. Now, her poetry is very short. Let me just read one, can I?
Sure.
Okay,
Please,
this is
please.
Rabia. Her story is rather interesting, and we certainly can't get into that today, but she says, this is one of her short poems: "Live with dignity, women. Live with dignity, men. Few things will more enhance our beauty as much." Isn't that kind of nice?
That's wonderful. for
Here's
sure.
one I like. "Why thank God has not touched everything that comes on your desk? But true, he may have kept the best for himself. That's just the way it goes." Like that?
Wonderful.
I like it. Yeah.
Well, it says something about God is present in the sublime as well as the mundane. He's
Exactly.
always there, he's always present. And I go back to like St. Francis of Assisi, who believed that God was present everywhere, in the trees and the grass and the rocks and in humans and the animals, the sun and the moon, that whole sense of being surrounded and wrapped in eternal presence.
That awareness of others, too, I think on that pillar where they were asked to be good stewards. And it's my understanding that they ask for 2.5% of everything, your property, your income. And I was at a dinner where a group had just come back from the Hajj, and it was all families that were there, no alcohol, just a beautiful setting, and they were talking about the Hajj and the people that were there. But they had a fundraiser, and I wish we had one like that. This fellow came in from New York, and everybody had a pledge out loud and bring their card up with that pledge on. And at that time, they got enough money to start their preschool or kindergarten over at the mosque. I'm not sure which one it was.
Well, that pillar of almsgiving is really, really crucial. Sometimes we tend to shy away from that. We talk about trying to be good stewards, but I believe Islam is trying to be a good steward of God's entire creation, as all Christian people are called to be. Let's go into the fasting, the pillar of fasting. And they do that during the holy time of Ramadan. Can you talk about Ramadan?
Well, Ramadan's the 9th month of the year, and I think what it celebrates is when Muhammad went to Mecca and actually made the Hajj himself. I think that's what it celebrates. During that season, they cannot eat or drink anything or engage in any sexual activity from the time the sun comes up until the time that the sun goes down in the evening. And it's interesting because at the end of Ramadan, and by the way, with the calendar they have, which is, I believe, the lunar calendar, Ramadan will appear at different times of the year. So if it's in the summertime, I noticed in working with the prisoners that it became very difficult because you couldn't have anything to drink. So that's a real sacrifice, I think, that's made at that time. But they have a feast at the end of Ramadan, called Eid al-Fitr, I believe. And it's almost like our Easter celebration. People come over, the little children get all dressed up, like we do at Easter, and they put on the new life, and it's a family celebration. It's a very beautiful one, yes.
That's good. We're down to the last 10 minutes of our time together. We want to go to the final and the 5th pillar, which is pilgrimage. And we talked briefly about Mecca. Can you tell us anything about the city of Mecca? Obviously, where it's at, why pilgrimage is so important to a Muslim.
Well, the Kaaba is there, which is the black meteorite that some believe Abraham put there, some believe that the angel Gabriel put it there. Now, they do not worship the Kaaba in this particular situation when they go to the Hajj. They circle it numerous times in their experience there. They say once they go to the Hajj or they make this trip that it changes their life. And I think Malcolm X, he was converted to Islam because he made the Hajj and saw that it was not all people from Arabic background, but you had people from all over the world, different ethnic groups, different nationalities, different countries, that whole universal dimension of it. He saw that, and I think that was what converted him, actually, to Islam.
When we talk about population and peoples, Islam is basically the second largest religion in the world, so it's 1 billion plus people. What would be some of the reasons why people are converted to Islam?
Well, there are different groups. So you have like the Shias, and then you have the very traditional group, the Sunnis. Now, I think according to what they believe and give testimony to, would attract different groups of people. Yesterday I was with a fellow from the Middle East, and he was telling me that the Shias are in Iran and Iraq, and then you find the more traditional that sticks with the Quran living in other parts of the country, and that they each practice in a different way. The Shias believe that there were 12 imams, spiritual leaders. The Shias believe that it's more of a political, that you don't divorce politics from religion. So it's probably what you are attracted to. Now, the Sunnis are, in Egypt? I know there's some in Egypt, some in Pakistan. I'm not sure of all the countries or areas that they're in right now. But I think people are attracted to different movements, just as you have in any other faith tradition too.
Let's talk about the Imam, because they're the holy person, the holy man. Are only men imams?
Now, I'm not sure right now, because I know in the Jewish tradition you have women rabbis, and the Christian tradition you have an Episcopalian Afro-American bishop that was made in the 60s. I'm not sure if they have female imams, but they certainly have a lot of women who are leaders and very articulate in when we go to the mosque. For every year they have a time in the spring where you can go to the mosque for a tour, enjoy their jewelry, enjoy the foods, and people, I know the students like to go and to have that experience. And a lot of times there are women there that are wonderful. Now, whether there are an imam or not, I don't know. That's something I'd like to know myself right now.
And let's talk about the mosque itself. I remember visiting some mosques around the world, obviously the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem.
Oh, yes.
I remember being in the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. One thing I remember is that before you go in, you take your shoes off.
Right.
And then there's a whole sense of the dress, whether you're man or woman, has to be presentable. Right. And so you can't go in shorts or cutoffs.
The woman would wear
sleeveless.
the hood, she would have her hair covered, etc. When they go to pray. Now, in the mosque here locally, the women are on one floor and they pray and the men are on the other. That's not true everywhere. And most businesses today will have a prayer room where they can go to these 5 times a day if they so choose.
Let's talk about that whole concept of peace. We're down to about 5 minutes of our time together. We I believe, want to really stress that Islam is really a religion of peace. Unlike what we might hear in modern culture or modern radio or television or newspapers, but it's truly a religion of peace. And there's that whole, as we talked about earlier, not only just submission, but surrender. So there's a peacefulness that's part of it. How important is it for us when we talk about the religion of Islam to focus on that?
Well, I think in education, I always say in teaching that the biggest sin in the whole world is ignorance, not to know. and not to understand a people. And the only way we can do that is by getting out of our comfort level and associating with people from other faith traditions, such as Islam. Once you relate to the people and you hear their individual stories and their history, that in itself brings about peace in our dialogue and our relationships. In any religion, that dialogue is so important to bring about a sense of peace and harmony among the people in that faith tradition. So it not only applies to Islam, but even to our own faith traditions.
And I think that's one of the purposes, for example, of this series, is to get people not only to understand better particular world religions, but also to respect other world religions. And how important is that in our own daily life as human beings, to be respectful of one another, no matter what our faith or what our religion or what our gender is.
And it's those differences. It's all those differences that makes life so exciting, to be able to share on that universal level, kind of like a cosmic reality that we can bring to our prayer. And I think prayer is very important, that if we want unity and harmony in the universe, it is through prayer and sacrifice and our own relationships with other people that model that. If our spirituality does not bespeak or is not visible in our actions, you begin to wonder about that dichotomy then. Are we back into a dualistic thinking, we, they?
Mm-hmm. And how important is it for us to be respectful of one another's faith traditions? And for example, us as Catholics being respectful of the Jewish community, or people of who are Muslim, how important that respect is, not only as a religion, but as people of faith.
As ordinary people of faith.
Ordinary people, exactly,
Right.
exactly. We're coming down to the last few minutes of our time together. Is there anything that we want to share with the folks about Islam that perhaps we haven't talked about or covered? The Quran, for example. Let's briefly mention the Quran.
There's about, 44 chapters in the Quran. And by the way, they mention Jesus as a wonderful prophet, but not the prophet in the Quran. And they talk about Mary as a woman of faith in the Quran, probably more so than we see in our own scriptures. So that's a very interesting thing. But there's also writings called the Hadiths, and these are narratives about the life of Muhammad, the stories about Muhammad. And then they have their mystical movement, which is the Sufi movement, and they have some beautiful writings there. I think also, we didn't mention the rug that they use for prayer. Very beautiful, kind of a paradise scene. The whole idea of unity and harmony, the Garden of Eden in our tradition, the future together. This is what Chardin would say heaven's going to be like, when we are all one in union and harmony with each other. There are differences, and I don't want to ever leave the impression there are not, and I think we should know those too. I find, and I've read in research, that nobody leaves their religion by studying another religion, that it usually reinforces their own faith tradition, but they can bring about the harmony that God asks from all of us, or Allah, or Brahman, all of those deities.
Well, Sister Nancy Dawson and I thank you for being with us for this edition of World Religion, especially talking about Islam. Have a good day, and God be with you.
World Religions was produced by CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Sister Nancy Dawson.